Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked across the hot desert sand. The sun was beating down hard on the Arizona wasteland, and his metal detector felt heavier with each step. He had been searching for 3 hours now, finding nothing but bottle caps and old nails. His friends always laughed at his hobby, calling it a waste of time. But Jake loved the thrill of discovery, the chance that he might find something amazing buried beneath the earth. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Red rocks jutted up from the sand like ancient teeth, and the only sound was the steady beeping of his metal detector. Jake had chosen this spot because it was far from any roads or hiking trails. If there was treasure to be found, it would be here in this forgotten corner of the world. He was about to give up and head back to his truck when the detector started screaming. The sound was so loud and sudden that Jake nearly dropped the device. He had never heard anything like it before. The needle on the display was buried deep in the red zone, spinning wildly as if it couldn't decide what it was detecting. Jake's heart began to race. This was it. This was the big find he had been dreaming about for years. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, scooping away the hot sand as fast as he could. The detector kept screaming, the sound echoing across the empty desert. After 10 minutes of frantic digging, Jake's fingers hit something hard. He brushed away more sand and saw a corner of metal poking through. It was dark, almost black, and unlike any metal he had ever seen. The surface seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it, giving it an strange, otherworldly appearance. Jake ran back to his truck and grabbed his folding shovel. He had to know what this was. The hole grew deeper and wider as he worked, the desert heat forgotten in his excitement. 20 feet down, he finally uncovered the entire object. It was a crate roughly the size of a coffin. The metal was smooth and seamless, with no visible joints or welds. Strange symbols were carved deep into the surface, burned into the metal as if by some incredible heat. The symbols hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and move when Jake wasn't focusing on them. Jake sat back on his heels, breathing hard. This was definitely not normal. The crate looked ancient, older than anything he had ever seen, but the metal showed no signs of rust or decay. It was as if time itself had no power over this strange box. He reached out to touch the surface, then pulled his hand back. Something felt wrong. The air around the crate seemed thick and heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The hair on his arm stood up, and he could taste metal in his mouth. That's when he heard the voice. "Please don't open." Jake jumped backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice had come from inside his head, clear as if someone was standing right next to him. He looked around wildly, but the desert was empty. There was no one else for miles. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The voice came again, tired and desperate. "Human, I can sense your thoughts. Do not open this container. You must not open it." Jake's hands were shaking now. He had found a lot of strange things over the years, but none of them had ever talked to him. This was impossible. People didn't hear voices in their heads. That was crazy talk. "Who are you?" Jake whispered, feeling foolish for talking to empty air. "What is this thing?" There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again, weaker this time. "My name is Zephyr. I am the last guardian of this prison. What lies within must never be released." Jake stared at the crate. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, and he could swear he heard something moving inside. A soft scratching sound like claws on metal. "Prison?" Jake asked. "What's in there?" "Something that should have been destroyed long ago," Zephyr replied. "Something that your people fought and died to contain. Please, human, you must walk away. Cover this place with sand and never return." But Jake couldn't walk away. The crate drew him like a magnet. He had spent his whole life looking for something special, something that would make him more than just another face in the crowd. This was his chance. This was his moment. "How long have you been down there?" Jake asked. 10,000 years, Zephyr said. 10,000 years of standing guard, keeping the seal intact. But my strength is failing. I can feel the barriers weakening. Jake walked around the crate, studying the symbols. They were definitely not human writing. Some looked like twisted animals, others like mathematical equations that made no sense. But as he stared at them, he began to understand their meaning, not with his mind, but with something deeper. Something in his blood. "You're not human," Jake said. It wasn't a question. "No," Zephyr confirmed. "I am what your people once called a guardian. We were the first to encounter the darkness, the first to fight against it, but we were not strong enough. Only your species had the will to do what was necessary." Jake's head was spinning. This was insane. He was a construction worker from Phoenix, not some hero from a science fiction movie. He liked cold beer and football games. He had never even left the country, let alone fought aliens. "I think you have the wrong guy," Jake said. "I'm nobody." "Special. You are human," Zephyr said simply. "That makes you special? Your people were bred for war, shaped by conflict until you became something unique in the galaxy. You are the weapon that the universe forged to fight the darkness." Jake laughed nervously. "I think I've been out in the sun too long. I'm hearing things." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The voice in his head was real. The crate was real. And somewhere deep inside him, ancient memories were starting to stir. He could almost remember things that had never happened to him. Battles fought among the stars, ships larger than cities, an enemy that devoured light itself. "The memories are genetic," Zephyr explained, reading his thoughts. "Your ancestors encoded them into your very DNA. Every human carries the knowledge of the old war, buried deep in their cells. The crate is designed to unlock those memories, to restore what was lost." Jake stepped closer to the crate. There was a seam around the edge, so thin he could barely see it. And in the center, a small depression that looked like it might fit a human hand. "If I open it," Jake said slowly, "what happens?" "Your people will remember," Zephyr said. "They will remember who they were, what they could do. They will remember the enemy that is still out there, waiting for the chance to return. And when they remember, the war will begin again." Jake's hand hovered over the depression. His whole life, he had felt like he was waiting for something. Like there was a purpose he was supposed to fulfill, a destiny he was supposed to claim. Maybe this was it. "The choice is yours," Zephyr said sadly. "I cannot stop you. I can only warn you. If you open that crate, everything will change. There will be no going back to your simple life. Humanity will rise again, but so will the darkness that nearly destroyed them." Jake looked up at the vast desert sky. Somewhere out there, among the stars, an ancient enemy was waiting. And somewhere in his DNA, the memory of how to fight them was encoded in his very cells. He pressed his palm against the depression in the crate. Jake pulled his hand back from the crate as if it had burned him. The metal was ice cold despite the desert heat, and he could feel power humming beneath the surface. Something was alive in there, waiting. He had come so close to opening it. But at the last second, fear had stopped him. "Wise choice," Zephyr said in his mind, sounding relieved. Few humans would have shown such restraint. Jake set up his small camping tent 20 feet away from the crate. He told himself he would stay for just one night, then cover the thing with sand and leave. But as the sun set over the Arizona desert, he found himself unable to walk away. The crate called to him like a song he couldn't get out of his head. "Tell me about the war," Jake said as he ate beans from a can. "Tell me what really happened." Zephyr was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Your people were not always as they are now. Humans once traveled between the stars as easily as you drive your cars today. Earth was just one world among many that humanity called home." Jake looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was hard to imagine humans living up there, flying between planets like something from a movie. But as Zephyr spoke, images began to form in Jake's mind. Not his own memories, but something older. Something that felt like remembering a dream. "The galaxy was peaceful then," Zephyr continued. "Hundreds of species lived together, sharing knowledge and resources. Trade ships carried goods between worlds. Children played in parks under alien suns. It was a golden age that lasted for thousands of years. What changed?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be terrible. The Devourers came from beyond the edge of known space. They were unlike anything we had ever encountered. Most species need food, water, air to survive. The Devourers consumed something else entirely. They ate the very fabric of reality itself. Jake shivered despite the warm night air. What do you mean? Imagine a fire that burns not wood or paper, but the idea of wood and paper. The Devourers would arrive at a world and begin to feed. First, the planet's energy would drain away. Then the matter itself would start to dissolve. Finally, even the memory of that world would vanish, as if it had never existed at all. The images in Jake's mind grew clearer. He saw ships the size of cities, their hulls black as the space between stars. He saw planets withering and dying, their surfaces cracking like old paint. He saw billions of people screaming as they faded from existence. The first worlds to fall were on the outer rim, Zephyr said. We thought it was some kind of natural disaster. By the time we realized we were under attack, entire star systems had been consumed. The Devourers moved toward the center of the galaxy like a plague, and nothing could stop them. Jake's hands were shaking. How many died? Trillions. Species that had existed for millions of years were wiped out in days. The Devourers were not just destroying our worlds, they were erasing our very existence. Those who died were not just killed, they were unmade, as if they had never been born. The fire in Jake's small camp crackled and popped. He added another piece of wood, grateful for the light and warmth. The desert night seemed full of shadows now, and every sound made him jump. My people, the Guardians, were the first to fight back, Zephyr continued. We had weapons that could tear holes in space, shields that could turn back the heat of stars. But none of it worked against the Devourers. They consumed our energy. Weapons absorbed our strongest attacks. For every ship we destroyed, 10 more appeared. What about the other species? Jake asked. Didn't they fight too? Most fled. They loaded their populations onto ships and ran toward the far edges of the galaxy, hoping to escape. Others tried to hide, building deep shelters or moving to empty worlds where they thought they would be safe. A few, like my people, chose to fight, but we were losing. Jake could see it in his mind now. The great evacuation, millions of ships fleeing through space like a river of light. Families torn apart as they ran from world to world, always one step ahead of the darkness that followed children who would never see their homes again. The humans were different, Zephyr said, and Jake heard something like admiration in the alien's voice. While others ran or hid, your people got angry. They didn't just fight the Devourers, they studied them. They learned how the enemy thought, how they moved, how they fed. And slowly humans began to win battles. We were good at fighting? Jake asked. You were the best. Humans had something that no other species possessed. You called it stubbornness, but it was more than that. When faced with impossible odds, when defeat seemed certain, humans would fight even harder. You refused to give up, even when giving. Up was the smart thing to do? Jake thought about his own life. He had always been the type to keep going when things got tough. When he lost his job, he found another one. When his girlfriend left him, he picked himself up and kept trying. Maybe there was something to what Zephyr was saying. The human military became the backbone of the resistance, Zephyr continued. Your ships were smaller and faster than ours, but they hit harder. Your soldiers were fearless in battle, willing to sacrifice themselves to save others. And your leaders, they saw things that the rest of us missed. The images in Jake's mind shifted. He saw human warships, sleek and deadly, dancing between the massive Devourer vessels. He saw Marines in powered armor fighting hand-to-hand with creatures that seemed to be made of living shadow. He saw commanders making impossible decisions, choosing to save millions by sacrificing thousands. We were winning, Zephyr said. Slowly, painfully, but we were pushing them back. The Devourers had never faced resistance like this. They began to make mistakes, to show weaknesses. For the first time since the war began, we had hope. What went wrong? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. The Devourers learned from their defeats. They changed their tactics, became more cunning. Instead of attacking worlds directly, they began to corrupt them from within. They would send small fragments of themselves to infect a planet's core, turning the world itself into a weapon. Jake saw green worlds turning black, their surfaces cracking open to reveal writhing masses of shadow. He saw entire populations turning against each other, their minds twisted by the Devourer influence. The infection spread faster than we could stop it, Zephyr said. World after world fell, not to direct attack, but to corruption from within. The alliance began to fracture as species turned against each other. Fear and paranoia replaced cooperation. But you said humans were different, Jake said. What did they do? They made a choice that still haunts me, Zephyr replied. The human. Leadership gathered their greatest minds, their best warriors, their most powerful ships. They developed a plan that would either save the galaxy or destroy it entirely. The desert wind picked up, making the flames of Jake's fire dance. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and waited for Zephyr to continue. They were going to use Earth as bait, Zephyr said quietly. The humans would make it look like their homeworld was defenseless, drawing the main devourer fleet into a trap. Then they would detonate a weapon that would tear a hole in space itself, banishing the devourers to a prison dimension where they could never escape. Did it work? Jake asked. Yes, Zephyr said. And no, the trap succeeded. Beyond their wildest dreams. The devourers were imprisoned, cut off from our reality forever, but the cost was everything. The explosion that created the prison also destroyed the human fleet, wiped out their technology, scattered their people across 1,000 primitive worlds. Jake stared at the crate. What happened to the survivors? They had their memories erased, their advanced knowledge locked away in their genetic code. They were meant to live simple lives until the danger passed, until we could be sure the prison would hold forever. Your people became farmers, hunters, builders. They forgot the stars and learned to love the earth beneath their feet. But the prison is failing, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Zephyr said sadly. The devourers are patient, but they are not idle. For 10,000 years, they have been testing the barriers, looking for weaknesses. The crate you found contains the key to unlocking your people's memories. If opened, it will restore humanity's knowledge, their technology, their purpose. But it will also send a signal to the devourers, letting them know that their ancient enemy has returned. Jake looked at the crate again. Such a small thing to hold such power. Such a terrible choice to make. What do you think I should do? He asked. I think, Zephyr said slowly, that the choice was never mine to make. It belongs to humanity alone. But I will say this, Jake Morrison. If you open that crate, your people will remember who they were. They will remember their strength, their courage, their refusal to surrender. But they will also remember the enemy that nearly destroyed them, and that enemy will remember them. Jake nodded and settled back against his sleeping bag. Tomorrow, he would have to decide. Tonight, he would listen to the wind and think about the weight of 10,000 years of history resting on his shoulders. Jake woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. The desert morning was cool and quiet, with only the distant call of a hawk breaking the silence. He had slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of burning worlds and ships fighting in the darkness of space. The crate sat exactly where he had left it, its strange symbols seeming to pulse with their own inner light. He grabbed his phone and saw dozens of missed calls and text messages. His boss at the construction company, his sister in California, even his ex-girlfriend from 2 years ago. All of them saying the same thing. People were acting strange. People were having weird dreams. People were drawing pictures of things they had never seen before. Jake scrolled through the news on his phone. The headlines made no sense. Construction worker builds spaceship engine in garage. 5-year-old draws perfect star chart. Farmer claims he remembers fighting aliens. The stories all had one thing in common. Normal people were suddenly knowing things they shouldn't know. It's starting, Zephyr said in his mind, his voice weaker than before. The awakening has begun. Your discovery of the crate has triggered something in the human genetic code. The memories are starting to surface. Jake looked at the crate with new fear. But I didn't open it. You didn't need to, Zephyr replied. The key inside responds to human presence. Just being near it for this long has activated some of its power. The signal is weak, but it's spreading. Soon every human on Earth will begin to remember. Jake's phone rang. It was his sister Linda in Los Angeles. She was a kindergarten teacher, the most normal person he knew. She had never shown any interest in science fiction or space travel. Jake, something weird is happening, Linda said without even saying hello. Her voice was shaky and confused. I keep having these dreams about flying between stars. And today, when I was teaching the kids, I started drawing these complex math equations on the board. I don't even know what they mean, but they feel important. Linda, listen to me, Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. I need you to stay home today. Don't go to work. Don't talk to anyone about the dreams. Why? What's going on? And how... Do you know about the dreams? Jake didn't know how to explain. How could he tell his sister that he had found an alien artifact in the desert? That humanity used to be a warrior race that fought monsters from beyond the stars? She would think. He had lost his mind. Just trust me, he said. I'll explain everything later. After he hung up, Jake checked the news again. The strange stories were multiplying by the hour. A mechanic in Detroit had built a device that generated clean energy from nothing. A housewife in Texas was speaking, in a language that linguists couldn't identify. Children around the world were drawing the same symbol, a complex design that hurt to look at directly. The symbol they're drawing, Jake said to Zephyr. It's one of the ones on the crate. The human fleet insignia, Zephyr confirmed. Your people are remembering their military heritage. The knowledge is encoded in every cell of their bodies, waiting for the right trigger to unlock it. Jake walked around the crate, studying it with new eyes. The symbols were starting to make sense to him, as if he was remembering a language he had known as a child. He could almost read them now. Words, like weapon, guardian, and last hope, seemed to float up from the depths of his mind. What happens if I open it? Jake asked. The full awakening, Zephyr said. Every human on Earth will remember everything. Your technology, your tactics, your purpose. But they will also remember the enemy, and the enemy will sense their return. Jake's phone buzzed with another news alert. Military bases report unusual activity. He clicked on the story and read about soldiers around the world suddenly understanding advanced weapon systems they had never been trained on. Fighter pilots were requesting modifications to their aircraft that didn't exist yet. Naval officers were drawing designs for ships that could operate in space. The military is remembering first, Zephyr observed. Your warrior instincts are the strongest part of your genetic heritage. They will be the ones to lead humanity's return to the stars. Jake thought about his own time in the army. He had served for 4 years after high school, mostly doing construction work on military bases. He had never seen combat, never fired a shot in anger. But lately he had been having dreams about leading troops into battle against creatures made of shadow and hunger. Am I remembering too? He asked. You are the first, Zephyr said. Your proximity to the crate has accelerated your awakening. You are beginning to remember who you were in the old war. Images flashed through Jake's mind. He saw himself in a uniform he had never worn, standing on the bridge of a ship that sailed through space instead of water. He was giving orders to soldiers who looked human but moved with inhuman speed and precision. He was planning battles against an enemy that could erase entire worlds from existence. I was a general, Jake said, the memory feeling as real as his own childhood. I led the final assault on the Devourer homeworld. You were more than that, Zephyr said quietly. You were the one who proposed the sacrifice. The plan to use Earth as bait was yours? Jake sat down hard on the desert sand. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. He had been responsible for the destruction of human civilization. He had chosen to wipe out everything his people had built in order to save the galaxy. The decision was correct, Zephyr said, reading his thoughts. Without that sacrifice, the Devourers would have consumed everything. Your people chose to give up their advanced civilization so that life itself could continue. But now they're coming back, Jake said. The Devourers, they're going to break free. Yes, the prison grows weaker each day. I estimate we have perhaps a year before the barriers fail completely. When that happens, they will remember humanity. They will remember their defeat. And they will come seeking revenge. Jake stood up and began pacing. Around the world, humans were awakening to their true nature. But they were scattered, confused, unprepared. Most didn't even understand what was happening to them. They needed leadership. They needed someone to guide them through the transformation. What would happen if I opened the crate today? Jake asked. The awakening would be complete within hours, Zephyr said. Every human would remember everything. Your scientists would understand technologies beyond current comprehension. Your military would know tactics that could defeat any enemy. Your leaders would unite your people as they did before. And the Devourers? They would sense the change immediately. The prison would begin to collapse as they pressed against the weakening barriers. You would have perhaps months to prepare for their return instead of years. Jake thought about his sister Linda, drawing equations she didn't understand. About children around the world having nightmares about dark ships. About soldiers remembering weapons that didn't exist yet. The awakening was already happening, but it was slow and chaotic. People were confused and afraid. If I don't open it, Jake said, the awakening will continue on its own? Yes, but slowly, too slowly. By the time your people fully remember who they are, the Devourers will have broken free. Humanity will face the enemy while still divided. And unprepared, Jake looked at his phone again. The news was getting worse. Some people were having complete mental breakdowns as alien memories flooded their minds. Others were building devices that government scientists couldn't understand. There were reports of riots in major cities as people began to panic about their changing world. They need guidance, Jake said. They need someone who understands what's happening. They need their general, Zephyr agreed. They need the one who led them before to lead them again. Jake approached the crate and placed his hand on the cold metal surface. The symbols were glowing brighter now, responding to his touch. He could feel the power humming inside, waiting to be released. The weight of 10,000 years of history pressed down on him. If I do this, Jake said, there's no going back. There was never any going back, Zephyr replied. The moment you found this crate, the path was set. The only choice now is whether humanity faces the coming storm united or divided. Jake thought about his sister, about the children drawing pictures of spaceships, about the soldiers remembering battles they had never fought. They were all counting on him, whether they knew it or not. The fate of not just humanity, but the entire galaxy rested on his decision. He took a deep breath and pressed his palm against the activation panel. The crate began to glow with brilliant white light, and Jake felt the power inside it calling to something deep in his DNA. The ancient memories of his people, locked away for 10,000 years, were about to return. I'm sorry, he whispered. To Zephyr, don't be, the alien replied, his voice already fading. You're doing what humans do best. You're choosing to fight instead of surrender. The galaxy is about to remember why it feared and respected your people. Jake closed his eyes and activated the key. The awakening had begun. The moment Jake's hand touched the activation panel, the world changed forever. A wave of pure energy exploded from the crate, invisible to the naked eye but felt in the bones and blood of every human being on Earth. The wave moved faster than light itself, carried by quantum connections that linked every member of humanity across space and time. In hospitals and homes, in offices and farms, in cities and wilderness areas, 7 billion people suddenly stopped what they were doing as 10,000 years of suppressed memories came flooding back. Jake collapsed to his knees in the desert sand, his mind overwhelmed by the returning knowledge. He remembered everything now. Not just his life as General Jake Morrison of the Human Defense Fleet, but the lives of countless other humans who had fought and died in the war against the Devourers. The genetic memory banks of his entire species were opening like flowers. In his consciousness, he remembered the first human colony ship that had left Earth, carrying families to distant stars. He remembered the golden age of exploration when humans had spread across hundreds of worlds. He remembered the day the Devourers came, and how quickly everything had changed from peace to war, but most of all, he remembered the final battle. Jake had stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiance as the human fleet prepared for its last mission. Thousands of ships filled the space around Earth, ready to sacrifice everything to save the galaxy. Every human soldier knew they would not survive the mission, but they had volunteered anyway, because that's what humans did. They fought for. Others, even when it meant their own destruction, around the world, other humans were experiencing similar awakenings. Jake's sister Linda was no longer just a kindergarten teacher in Los Angeles. She was Dr. Linda Morrison, chief scientist of the Terraforming Division, whose work had allowed humans to live on 100 different worlds. The equations she had been drawing weren't random. They were the blueprints for atmospheric processors that could turn dead rocks into garden worlds. In Detroit, the mechanic who had built the strange energy device was remembering his true identity as Chief Engineer Marcus Cole. The device he had constructed was a miniature fusion reactor technology that humanity had perfected thousands of years ago. He looked at his dirty garage with new eyes, seeing not a place to fix cars but a laboratory, where he could build the ships that would carry humanity back to the stars. At military bases around the world, soldiers were standing straighter as ancient. Knowledge filled their minds. Colonel Sarah Williams at Fort Bragg suddenly understood why she had always been the best tactician in her unit. She wasn't just a human soldier. She was the reincarnation of Fleet Admiral Williams, who had led the defense of the Vega system against a Devourer invasion fleet. The changes weren't just mental. The genetic modifications that had been locked in human DNA for 10,000 years were finally activating. Reaction times increased. Strength and endurance improved. Senses became sharper. Humans were becoming what they had been designed to be, the perfect weapon against the darkness between the stars, but the transformation came with a price. Not everyone could handle the sudden flood of memories and abilities. In hospitals around the world, people were collapsing as their minds tried to process lifetimes of experiences that had never been their own. Some went catatonic, lost in the overwhelming tide of genetic memory. Others became violent, acting out battles from an ancient war. Jake forced himself to stand, using his newfound knowledge to steady his mind. He was no longer just a construction worker from Arizona. He was the supreme commander of humanity's military forces, and his people needed him. The awakening was chaotic and dangerous. Without proper guidance, it could tear human civilization apart. He pulled out his phone and made a call. The number came to him from memories that were both his and not his. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. Admiral Chun speaking. Lisa. It's Jake Morrison. I've activated the key. There was a long pause. Then Lisa Chun, who had been a quantum physicist in California just hours ago, spoke again. Her voice was different now, filled with the authority of someone who had once commanded fleets of starships. Jake? My God, I remember everything. The war, the sacrifice, the plan. Is it really you? It's me, and we don't have much time. The Devourers will sense what we've done. How long do we have? The quantum signatures are already spreading, Lisa said. Jake could hear the sound of typing in the background as she accessed knowledge that had been locked away for millennia. I estimate 6 months before they can break through the dimensional barriers. Maybe less if they focus all their energy on escape. Then we need to move fast. Contact the other fleet commanders? We need to start rebuilding immediately. Already. On it. I've got calls in to Admiral Rodriguez in Moscow and Fleet Captain Thompson in London. The nuclear powers are going to be key. We'll need their resources to build the new ships. Jake looked at the empty crate, its purpose finally fulfilled. Zephyr's presence was completely gone now, the ancient guardian's energy finally exhausted. After 10,000 years of vigilance, Jake said a silent prayer for the alien who had tried so hard to prevent this moment. Even though Jake knew it had been inevitable, the next few hours were a blur of activity. Jake drove back to Phoenix, his mind racing with plans and preparations. The city looked different to him now. Instead of just buildings and roads, he saw resources and strategic positions. The airport could be converted to handle military transports. The industrial areas could be retooled to manufacture components for starships. The population centers would need to be organized and trained. By the time he reached his apartment, the world was already changing. The news was full of reports about the mass awakening. World leaders were holding emergency meetings as their populations suddenly developed abilities and knowledge that defied explanation. Stock markets were crashing as people abandoned their jobs to pursue their recovered memories, but there were positive signs too. In research facilities around the world, scientists were beginning to understand technologies that had been theoretical. Just days ago, the first fusion reactors were already being built. Communication networks were being upgraded to handle faster-than-light transmissions. Weapon systems that could fight enemies from beyond the stars were being designed. Jake's phone rang constantly. Military commanders, government officials, and ordinary people who remembered their roles in the ancient war. They all wanted guidance from the man who had led humanity's last stand against the Devourers. "General Morrison," said a voice he recognized. "As President Harrison, we need to talk. The Joint Chiefs are meeting in 1 hour. We need to know what we're facing." "Mr. President," Jake replied, his voice carrying the authority of his recovered rank. "What we're facing is the end of the world as we know it, but also the chance to become something greater than we ever imagined." The meeting was held in the Pentagon, in a room that Jake remembered from a different life. The faces around the table were familiar, even though they belonged to people he had never met in this lifetime. They were the reincarnations of his old command staff, scattered across different countries and military branches, but united by shared memories of ancient battles. "The situation is simple," Jake told them. "Humanity is waking up from a 10,000-year sleep. We have perhaps 6 months to rebuild our civilization and prepare for war. The enemy that nearly destroyed us once is coming back, and this time we need to be ready." "What do we need?" asked General Hayes, who Jake remembered as his old chief of staff. "Everything. Ships, weapons, trained crews, orbital facilities. We need to go from a primitive planetary civilization to a galactic military power in less than half a year." "That's impossible," said Admiral Brooks. Jake smiled grimly. 6 months ago, you would have been right. But we're not the same species we were 6 months ago. We're not even the same species we were this morning. We're humans, and impossible is what we do best. Over the next few days, the transformation accelerated. Factories that had been making cars suddenly started producing spacecraft components. Universities began teaching courses on faster-than-light travel and alien biology. Children who had been learning basic math were now studying quantum mechanics and tactical theory. The first new starship launched exactly 1 week after. Jake opened the crate. It was a small scout vessel built from plans that had been encoded in human DNA for 10,000 years. The ship's crew consisted of a baker from Maine, a truck driver from Texas, and a nurse from Oregon. But they were also the reincarnations of the crew of the scout ship Pathfinder, and they flew their new vessel as if they had been born to it. Jake stood in mission control and watched the ship disappear into the darkness between the stars. It was humanity's first step back into the galaxy, and possibly their last. The Devourers were still out there, pressing against the weakening barriers of their prison. Time was running out, but as Jake looked around the control room, filled with humans who remembered their true purpose, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 10,000 years of genetic memory. Hope. The war was coming. But this time, humanity would be ready. 6 months after Jake Morrison opened the crate in the Arizona desert, humanity was no longer the same species that had awakened to his discovery. The transformation had been complete and terrifying in its speed. Earth's orbit was filled with construction platforms building ships that dwarfed anything humans had ever imagined. The moon had been converted into a massive shipyard, its surface covered with factories that worked around the clock. Mars was being terraformed at an impossible rate. Its red surface already showing patches of green where new atmosphere processors had taken hold. Jake stood on the bridge of the flagship Resurrection, watching his fleet prepare for battle. 3,000 ships hung in space around him, each one a masterpiece of rediscovered technology. The vessels were sleek and deadly, their hulls made from materials that could withstand the heat of stars. Weapon systems that fired compressed gravity and folded space dotted their surfaces like metallic thorns, but the ships were only part of humanity's transformation. The people crewing them were no longer fully human in the way their ancestors would have understood. The genetic modifications that had been sleeping in their DNA had activated completely. They moved faster, thought quicker, and could survive in environments that would have killed their predecessors. Some could breathe in the vacuum of space for short periods. Others could see across the entire electromagnetic spectrum or communicate through quantum entanglement. "Admiral Morrison," came a voice from the communications station. It was Lieutenant Davis, a young woman who had been a high school student 6 months ago. Now, she was one of the most skilled sensor operators in the fleet, her mind enhanced to process information at superhuman speeds. Long-range sensors are detecting dimensional distortions at the edge of the solar system. Jake felt his enhanced reflexes kick in, time seeming to slow as his mind processed the implications. The prison was finally breaking. After 10,000 years of captivity, the Devourers were coming home. "Send the alert to all ships," Jake ordered. "Battle stations, this is not a drill." Across the fleet, thousands of humans prepared for the war they had been bred to fight. In weapon bays, soldiers loaded ammunition that could tear holes in reality itself. In engineering sections, crews made final adjustments to shields that could turn back the combined fire of 100 stars. In medical bays, doctors prepared to treat wounds that could affect not just the body, but the soul. The enemy appeared without warning. One moment, the space at the edge of the solar system was empty. The next, it was filled with ships that hurt to look at directly. The Devourer vessels were black as the void between galaxies, their surfaces seeming to absorb light and hope in equal measure. They moved in patterns that made no sense, following courses that twisted through dimensions humans could barely perceive. "My God," whispered Captain Rodriguez from the destroyer Vengeance. "There are so many of them." Jake counted the enemy ships on his tactical display. 10,000 vessels, each one the size of a small moon. The Devourers had spent their imprisonment well, building a fleet that could consume entire star systems. But as Jake studied their formation, he noticed something that made him smile grimly. "They're using the same tactics," he announced to his fleet. 10,000 years in prison, and they haven't learned anything new. They still think like predators, hunting scattered prey. The first exchange of fire lit up the darkness of space like a new sun being born. Devourer weapons reached across millions of miles, beams of pure entropy that could age entire planets to dust in seconds. But the human ships were no longer where the beams struck. Enhanced reflexes and quantum computers allowed them to predict and dodge attacks that moved at the speed of light. Human return fire was different from anything the galaxy had seen before. Instead of simple energy weapons, humanity had learned to weaponize the fundamental forces of reality. Gravity cannons that could crush ships into singularities, temporal missiles that aged their targets backwards until they ceased to exist, reality anchors that prevented the Devourers from shifting between dimensions. Direct hit on the enemy. "Flagship," reported Commander Hayes from the battleship Defiance. "Their shields are adapting, but slowly." Jake watched the battle unfold on his screens, his enhanced mind processing tactical information faster than any computer. The human fleet was smaller than the enemy armada, but they were fighting with advantages the Devourers had never faced before. Humanity had spent 10,000 years evolving, not just technologically but genetically. They were no longer the same species that had fought the last war. "All ships, implement Pattern 7, Jake ordered. Pattern 7 was a battle formation that had never been used in the original war. It was something new, created by human minds that had been enhanced. Beyond their original limits, the human fleet scattered like leaves in a wind, each ship moving on an apparently random course. But Jake could see the pattern, the way each vessel's path intersected with dozens of others to create a web of overlapping fire zones. The Devourers tried to follow, but their massive ships were too slow to keep up with humanity's enhanced reflexes. "Admiral," came a new voice from the communications array. It was Dr. Linda Morrison, Jake's sister, speaking from the research vessel Discovery. "I'm detecting something strange about their quantum signatures. The Devourers aren't the same as they were." "Before, what do you mean?" Jake asked, even as he coordinated the destruction of 3 enemy cruisers. "They're weaker. The imprisonment changed them. They've been feeding on their own energy for 10,000 years, cannibalizing themselves to survive. They're shadows of what they once were." Jake felt hope bloom in his chest. The Devourers had always seemed unstoppable, and force of nature that consumed everything in its path. But they weren't forces of nature. They were living beings, and living beings could be wounded, weakened, defeated. "All ships, focus fire on the enemy command vessel," Jake ordered. "If we can break their coordination, the rest will scatter." The battle that followed would be remembered in human history books for as long as the species survived. 3,000 human ships focused their fire on a single Devourer dreadnought, pouring enough energy into the target to power entire civilizations. The enemy vessel's shields held for nearly a minute, adaptive defenses trying desperately to counter weapons they had never encountered before. Then the shields failed. The Devourer flagship came apart like a flower made of shadow and malice. Its destruction sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet as the creatures inside realized that they were no longer the ultimate predators of the galaxy. For the first time in their species' existence, the Devourers felt fear. "They're breaking formation," reported Captain Williams from the carrier Horizon. "The enemy fleet is scattering." Jake watched as the remaining Devourer ships began to flee, their black hulls disappearing into the deeper darkness between stars. But he knew they wouldn't get far. The human fleet was faster now, more maneuverable. And unlike the last war, they had the numbers to hunt down every last enemy vessel. "Begin pursuit," Jake ordered. "No survivors. We end this today." The hunt that followed lasted for 3 days. Human ships chased fleeing Devourers across the solar system and beyond, running them down one by one. Some enemy vessels tried to hide in asteroid fields or the gravity wells of gas giants. Others attempted to flee to distant star systems. But humanity's enhanced senses could track them anywhere, and their improved weapons could reach them no matter where they ran. The last Devourer ship was cornered near the orbit of Pluto. It was a small scout vessel, probably meant to carry word of humanity's return to other Devourer fleets in distant galaxies. Jake's ship, the Resurrection, closed in for the final kill. "This is Admiral Jake Morrison of the Human Defense Fleet," he broadcast on all frequencies. 10,000 years ago, you made the mistake of threatening our galaxy. Today, you pay the price for that mistake." The scout ship tried to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Human weapons reached out across the void and embraced it in fire. When the light faded, there was nothing left but cooling plasma and the memory of an ancient threat finally put to rest. Jake stood on his bridge and looked out at the stars. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy was truly safe. The Devourers were gone, not just defeated, but extinct. Humanity had kept its promise to stand guard against the darkness. "Admiral," came a voice from behind him. It was Commander Chun, his old friend who had awakened to find herself remembering a lifetime of commanding starships. "What are your orders?" Jake smiled and gestured toward the distant stars. "We go home, all of us. Humanity has spent too long hiding on one small world. It's time to reclaim our place among the stars." The human fleet turned toward the galaxies, toward worlds that had once been home to their ancestors. They would rebuild the old colonies, establish new ones, and ensure that never again would the darkness find the galaxy UNDEFENDED behind them. Earth continued to turn in its ancient orbit, blue and peaceful in the light of its sun. The people there would remember this day and the choice that Jake Morrison had made in an Arizona desert. They would remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was exactly what needed to be done. And in the depths of space, where the last Devourer ship had died, a new star began to shine.